please check in with me so I can know if folks can clearly hear me or not. But so getting back into this, part of the reason I really enjoy this program is because I think historically when I've done programming around sexual exploitation or CSEC, youth serving organizations, and this particular program is trying to build strengths with primary caregivers, which is a really nice place to be coming from. And really closing the gap is focusing on this piece of emotional intelligence, which I very much enjoy, and checking in with yourself, checking in with your youth and where you're at, and trying to build skills around emotional intelligence, both with yourself and with your youth. And I think that makes this program incredibly unique. And I really like the skills that it builds. So Christy, if you go to the next slide, in which I'll talk about the program is coming from Love 146 and Above the Path, which I want to tell you about a little bit before we get into the program. So Above the Path has worked in the field of child welfare and parent education for over 20 years. Through collective observation, they noted that caregivers were often provided awareness training and education about the risks youth face. However, many educational programs fell short of providing caregivers with the resources to enhance their skills while managing their stress and self-care. Skills that are necessary to strengthen foundation and build upon the protective factors needed to reduce risk-taking behaviors in youth. In response, Above the Path developed Closing the Gap, now through partnership with Love 146, an international human rights organization working to end child trafficking and exploitation. Above the Path has adopted the curriculum to specifically focus on reducing the risk for exploitation and trafficking of youth. So next slide. So really quick for today, again, I'm Naomi. I am an educator at the Advocacy Center. Real glad to be connecting with you all today. I think Christy did housekeeping. And I'll give information when I'm providing this full program, we will provide workbooks and pre and post text, but we will not be doing that today for timing reasons. And I also want to recognize that this is a space that we are going to have challenging conversations and also talk about the skills of parenting is just incredibly hard and challenging, and we're human and we're not perfect and we're going to fudge up, and there's space for that. So there's engagement with challenging topics and conversations. Christy, if we could go to the next slide. So the goals of the entire program, just recognize that as caregivers, we often have valid concerns about our youth, and sometimes youth behavior can be scary. There are not quick fixes for troublesome behavior, but we are going to work together to build our skills. We are going to learn skills to help improve our relationships and our communication. And we're going to work towards the reduction of risk. So we're going to learn steps that we can take forward in prevention, all the needed components for successful engagement and the implementation of that. We're going to learn how to recognize opportunities in our lives to implement each step towards prevention. We're going to spend some time practicing these steps so we become comfortable when back in the stressful environment. And we're going to provide the opportunity to strengthen our skills so we can feel empowered when seeking to reduce risk of our youth. So that is Love 146 in whole. Today, really, the goal for today is I'm going to give you a little teaser about the program. So I'm going to give you one of the steps that Closing the Gaps talks about. So hopefully get you all interested in receiving the other 4 or 5 hours of the program. Great, so next, beautiful. So these are the steps that the program goes through. So one is stress identification. So that's what I'm really going to be talking about today. So identifying your stress, your youth stress, when you're feeling really stressful, what are some, what's your goal? and what can you do to help lower your stress and your youth stress? And does stress look the same? Translating behavior. So this is, we're not going to be talking about today, but your go-to behaviors and your youth's go-to behaviors when they're feeling stressed out, when they're feeling emotional, what are their go-to behaviors? And what you're feeling versus what you're expressing, which can oftentimes be very different. So I'm feeling worried about you, but I'm expressing anger, right? So we really dive deep into that. And then it talks about the importance of staying connected and the youth staying connected and feeling like they have support systems. Enhancing communication, this piece is working on healthy communication skills and talking about the messaging your youth is receiving about themselves and about self-worth from society. Talking about prioritizing needs. So this is identifying your needs and your youth needs, and then really gets into the discussion of control and blame. So this piece of my youth is making choices and decisions that I don't want them to make. I'm feeling very out of control. And sometimes this can be translated to now I'm going to blame them. And we really get talking into victim blaming. And then finally, safety planning and response. So this is really working on the skills of safety planning, which is so, so important when we are trying to support the youth that we have in our house. So what are you going to do when you feel unsafe, or if you are in an unsafe situation? What are some resources that you have? Let's talk about making a plan to keep you safer. And how do I support your youth, and identify other reinforcements in case you're not there, or in case you're not the person that's going to respond. Who are the other support systems, and let's identify that. So next slide, please. So we have listed some examples of common issues on this slide that caregivers struggle with. In these situations, we are often unsure how to respond and where to start because these are really challenging and a lot of times emotionally charged conversations. We may wish for a quick fix to all the struggles we face with our youth. However, it is not all lost. Every strategy and plan we come up with to address these struggles will require tough, tricky, and emotional conversations. As caregivers, we have power to change, power to influence, power to protect. We all want our relationships to be as strong as possible and our communication to be as effective and need fulfilling. Okay, great. So next slide. Okay. What are we teaching our youth? So I think what we have to remember is we're constantly modeling for our youth about what is a healthy relationship. How do I get my needs met? How do I handle difficult conversations? How do I handle stress? How do I bring myself back down from stress? And what do I do to keep myself safe? In the chaos of our everyday lives, sometimes we forget how much influence we really have on our youth, how much we model throughout our own highs and lows, throughout every interaction we have, we're teaching. So when we're at our best of our best, and also when we're really deep down in that dark hole of stress and not feeling great, our youth are still picking up messaging from us and learning from us. We're going to spend some time talking about difficult situations and keeping youth safe. Specifically, we are going to focus on human trafficking prevention. This topic can be confusing and overwhelming, and let's talk through some definitions before we really get started and get into it. So next slide, please. So terms and definitions. So CSEC, or commercial sexual exploitation of children, is the abuse of power differentials or the exploitation of a person's vulnerabilities in order to induce a sex act in exchange of something of value. So really what we're focusing on here is somebody who is under 18, so youth. There's an exchange of something of value, which we'll talk a little bit more about later today. And then it's through force, fraud, or coercion. Human trafficking, so this can be either labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And today we're really going to be focusing on the sex trafficking aspect. Next slide, please. So these definitions can be difficult to understand. We're going to break it down and talk about specific examples to get a better understanding. So for example, I didn't have a place to stay. Someone offered to let me sleep on their couch, but I had to have sex with them first. Or my boyfriend told me he lost his job and couldn't pay rent. He asked me to help him out. He said his friend John would pay him $300 if I had sex with him. He told me he really needed my help. So some examples of exchanging sex for something of value. And when we talk about something of value, people often think about money, which sometimes it is that money. But also it can be a ride, it can be for drugs, it can be for a place to stay. So this is when I'm thinking about runaway and homeless youth, about how high risk they are because there are so many needs there, so many gaps there, that a trafficker can come in and fill that gap. This could be in exchange for items, for a cell phone, for new shoes, just something that is given to us that has value. What do I have as the next slide? Okay, so next slide, please. So creating that gap, right? How do we create that gap? And Chrissy, if you could give a little click. Beautiful. So the gaps are created out of vulnerabilities. This is really what we're talking about. So I have a need. My need is not met. That need becomes an empty space, and that space becomes a gap, right? So when we're talking about closing the gap, we're talking about how can we meet the needs that the youth have? And we're not always going to be that person that meets the needs, which is why we're going to talk about reinforcements and healthy communication. But how can we identify the needs, identify the gaps, identify the vulnerabilities, and help fill those in so somebody else does not come and fill in that gap, I'm sorry. It's really scary to think that our youth may be at risk for human trafficking. We're going to spend some time together talking about how this can happen, how someone might take advantage of our youth, and what power we have to prevent this. Sometimes the relationships we have with our youth are very strong. Other times when we are battling through situations, we may be unsure how to handle things and where to start. This may create a weak spot. These struggles can sometimes lead to barriers in our relationship, weakening our connection to our youth. With this in mind, we are going to take a look at the barriers that affect the strength of our relationships, barriers that turn into gaps. Gaps are openings, vulnerabilities, indications that something is missing. When our youth have gaps, they needed something and that need was not met. And when a need isn't met, we may find ourselves looking for alternative methods of fulfilling that need, and this can create risk. Additionally, throughout our lives, we can, from time to time, encounter people who do not have our best interests in mind, people who would see our gap and use this to their advantage. They may support our fulfillment in not so healthy ways. To minimize the gaps, we need to know where to begin. We need to focus, we need direction, we need structure, and how do we get there, right? And some of these gaps are just naturally there because it is age appropriate and our youth and teens are growing and their brain is developing in very healthy ways, but that creates really natural vulnerabilities, right? Like that needing to belong, that wanting to engage in a romantic relationship, wanting to feel loved and attractive and accepted. And also some of these really normal item needs, right? Like the newest cell phone or the newest shoes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Next slide, please. Okay, so stress identification. So when we're talking about steps, each step is an action, and we're going to spend some time talking about the first step today. While seeking to strengthen our relationships and communicate effectively, we are going to spend some time talking about stress, how both we as caregivers handle stress and how our youth handle stress. So next slide, please. So what is stress? Stress is defined as a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. We carry stress with us every day. It can make us feel powerless, out of control. Understanding how we tolerate stress and how to manage stress gives us a bit of control back. So I want you to spend some time thinking about what stress looks like for you. You can share this in the chat if you want. I'm gonna just talk about it for me. I know when I get stressed out, I get really clammy hands, which I have right now because I'm stressed about the internet connection. My heart rate goes up. My kind of like what happens in my brain, I can't think of clear thoughts, and it's like everything is intersecting with one another in my brain, and I cannot express myself coherently. So identifying what that feels like, it can be really helpful thinking about what happens to me both physically and psychologically when I'm feeling stressed out, and to spend some time thinking about that. And then an equally as important conversation to have, or something to process through, is what does stress look like with my youth? So there is a youth that I'm very close to, and stress for her looks very different. Stress for her looks like I'm cutting off the world, I'm going to go to sleep, I'm not going to reach out and talk to other people, right? So stress looks and feels differently, and we respond differently. So it's really starting there and identifying what stress looks like for me in my youth. Next slide, please. In trying to develop a visual understanding of stress, we'll use the concept of a stairway. Look at this stairway. So I wish, actually today, I'm probably gonna print out this stairway and put this right on my refrigerator. So when I'm feeling really stressed out, I can just not say anything and point my finger at the stress staircase so my partner knows that I'm at a 9 and not to talk to me, right? I just think this is a very useful visual that we have. The top of the steps symbolizes the utmost stress. We literally have nowhere left to go. We have reached our maximum stress. Look at the limited room on top. Out of room, out of options, fix it quick. Of course, how we fix it, how we release this stress is going to look different for everyone. We will talk more about these ways to release stress a little later. Next slide, please. We go up and down these steps all day, and so does everyone around us, including our youth. Why do you think it's important to recognize what step we're on? Nobody's going to talk, so I'm going to say something. The more stressed we are, the higher we are in the stairway, or the higher we are, the less room we have for making rational, well thought out decisions. I certainly know that when I'm at an 8, I shouldn't be doing any big decision making, or at that point, like communicating. I need to take a step, go for a walk, meditate, or do whatever it is to bring me way back down. Ideally, we would all start our day at the bottom, maybe living within a supportive household, having a well-planned schedule, and getting a good night of sleep would certainly help. Waking refreshed with no stress, calm and in control. But that is not always the case. We may already have began our climb before we even start the day. I think the only time I've ever really started on a 1, weirdly enough, was at the very, very beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't even know it was a pandemic, but I just knew I didn't have to come into work the next 2 days. I was like, woo! And I just swam in like snacks and sweatpants. And I woke up at a 1 every day, and it had not been stressful. Things have slightly changed since then. So there are many situations that would cause us not to start the day stress-free. So restless sleep, a day full of back-to-back meetings and arguments with somebody that I care about. We may start our day already on the wrong foot, feeling out of sorts, and so might our youth, maybe for the same types of reasons. We have many interactions with others and many different interactions with our youth through the course of our day. Remember the struggles that we mentioned before. So in this, we kind of do an exercise where we brainstorm, where do I start off my day, right? So I can share that I start off my day maybe at a 3 typically, but I know this youth that I'm close to starts off her day at maybe a 6, right? And that is like the level that she starts her day. And it's really important for me to recognize that there are more stressors going on in her life. There are more stressful and complicated social interactions that are going on in her life. She's a teenager and wanting to fit in, right? And with the stressors of social media and that very natural common need to fit in. So she's starting way higher than I am. So can we reflect that with the youth in our household that we're supporting? Next slide, please. So going back to these examples, they're challenging. and to provide the strongest, best caregiving skills we have in the most effective way, we must be in a good space, right? So lower on those steps to engage in these challenging conversations. However, we all experience stress. Even positive experiences can be stressful, and we all respond differently when under stress. Next slide, please. We all have that step at which nothing good happens. When we have climbed too high, in other words, if my stress level has passed this step, I have entered my range of unable to communicate effectively. And if I try to do so without calming myself first, chances are pretty good that it won't go well. Also, if I'm at this step, it becomes much easier for any little thing to bother me, to increase my step even further and bring me closer to blowing up than I already am. Right? So for me, that's like a 7 or an 8 to be able to identify that of nothing good will happen. If somebody says something to me, that's maybe when unfair name calling will start. This is when if I just drop a fork on the ground, maybe I'll start like hysterically crying because I'm so stressed out. So how can we identify where nothing good happens? And again, I think this is a great visual to have so we can acknowledge that I'm at an 8. And even though my teen just came home drunk from a party and it skyrocketed me to maybe a 9 or a 10, I should maybe identify that nothing good's going to happen here, even though I'm stressed out and I want to talk to them about safety. So maybe I'm going to wait till the morning when I'm back down to a 3 or a 4. So let's take a moment and think about our own stairway and our youth stairway. And where they're at, and can we have this conversation and use this visual with the youth and having them identify where nothing good happens. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is an example. My 14-year-old takes off for hours at a time when she's angry. I've spoken to her about this many times and she promised me that she would not do it anymore. Last night, she took off for 3 hours. So it's challenging to remind ourselves within the moment of high stress that as much as I want to have this conversation right now with my 14-year-old who takes off angry, I am not operating at an optimum performance and am entering the conversation at my weakest. That's okay. We all have these moments, but we also must have important conversations with our youths. What kind of tough conversations do we have? I think we have tough conversations all the time, whether it's talking about sexual health, whether it's talking about boundaries, where it's talking about healthy consequences and holding yourself accountable, holding your youth accountable. So we're engaging in these tough conversations all the time. To be at our most effective, those conversations must happen when we and our youth are able to tolerate them. The lower the steps, the more effective the conversation. So how do we lower the steps? It is important to recognize how stressors influence our response. Rising on the steps can cause a person to intend to behave one way, but end up reverting to an alternative behavior. Let's talk about intent versus tendency. There are behaviors we strive for. For example, patience. In a moment of calm, seems easy. Goals set for ourselves. But when a situation arises that requires patience, we may find ourselves being impatient, no matter how much we intend to be patient. When we are in a calm state of mind, sitting comfortably and lower on our steps, we feel like life is manageable. We know right from wrong, and we can see the bigger picture to the best of our capabilities. This is the place where we get the well-intentioned promise of change. This is the place where we make our own vows to handle things better, to respond differently. And most of the time, the intent is genuine. We fully intend to do what is promised, but because we are sitting lower on the steps, that goal seems achievable. However, when we start to rise in our steps and our stress becomes greater and more powerful, we may have the intent to behave one way, but the tendency to lean towards another way, to revert to an alternative behavior. The tendency becomes sort of a comfort zone when we don't know how to handle something. Next slide, please. So again, this intent versus tendency, I'm intending to be calm and low on the steps, but my tendency is I'm actually feeling very out of control because my teen is making decisions that I wish they wouldn't make. My intent is to be calm and serene and meditative and life is manageable. But my tendency, because of the stress I'm facing, is that I'm feeling my steps rising. My intent is to know right from wrong, right? I know exactly black and white, what is right and what is wrong. But my tendency is the situation I'm facing is everything's feeling overwhelming. My intent is to see the bigger picture. I'm going to sit there. I'm going to talk to my teen about why they're drinking and going out partying. The conversation's going to be great. But the tendency is I want control back and I want to tell you what to do and why you did it was wrong. My intent is good intention. My tendency is looking for resolution, right? So again, pointing out what you did wrong and kind of going to that blaming. Next slide, please. Okay. So scenario, Amy has a 16-year-old son. Amy is noticing that she tends to yell at her son a lot. She doesn't mean to, but she has been doing it more often. Amy has told herself, I really shouldn't yell. I'm going to stop that. So the intent not to yell at her daughter, her tendency to yell. Is she aware of her tendency? Yes. She recognizes that she yells and she doesn't want to do that anymore. And when is she aware of it? At a moment where she's lower on her steps and she has time to think about it. When we are calm, sitting lower in our steps, we can see the bigger picture. We can recognize where we want to change. And, you know, of course, when Amy's steps rise, she's probably going to revert back to her tendency and not have that emotional awareness or self-awareness. So next slide, please. So Amy had a rough day at work today. She came home to find the dog had gotten into the garbage and there's a huge pile of dishes in the sink. Amy is trying to get dinner ready and her son is asking to go to a party this weekend. Amy said no. Her son asked why. Amy yells the famous line, because I told you so. So where is Amy on her steps? I don't know. There's a lot of stressors here going on right now. She's trying to get the dinner on the table. She's staying late at work. There's the garbage there. Her son's asking her a question. So she's probably at like a 7 or an 8. So now Amy has decided, while sitting comfortably lower on her steps, not to yell anymore. Her intent is to be calm. And now she's higher on her steps. So she's lost that calm. Just as we may be challenged, our youth struggle with intent versus tendency as well. In moments of calm, when our youth promises not to do what we are asking them to do, we feel a sense of relief because that promise is what we are waiting to hear. What about our youth stressors? We know our youth go up and down their stairs every day, and we can see the more impactful our outside everyday stressors are, the harder it is to match intent to our tendency. Yet when we hear that promise, I won't do it again, we breathe a sigh of relief. We hold them to that promise. Next slide, please. So next we're going to look and focus on the ways that we can move up the stairway, sometimes suddenly and unexpectedly. So through exposure, what we call exposures and magnified feelings. So let's look at this example. I tripped and fell in front of a crowd last week and friends and strangers laughed at me. Now, every time I think about walking in front of a crowd, I get anxious and self-conscious. So what was the event? Tripping and falling. What was the exposure? Laughter from friends and strangers when I tripped. What were the feelings? Embarrassment, shame. And did this alter my view of the world and create a magnified feeling? Yes, right? Crowds make me anxious and I'm self-conscious. So, you know, exposure, the events that have altered our worldview, magnified feelings, the feelings that are attached to that event. So I know when I reflect back in when I started doing education in my career, I really flubbed up one of my earlier education programs. And I certainly had magnified feelings towards that. My next program, so many magnified feelings of just feeling shame and feeling like I was an imposter, like that imposter syndrome, right? And that was connected there a whole bunch of the times that I provided programming after that. So this was an easy situation to see, and not all of our exposures will lead to magnified feelings. Sometimes we can brush something off and move on, but other times these feelings and experiences stay with us. Sometimes we can't remember the event, but the magnified feeling stays with us. And that's really important. So sometimes we don't remember, but the magnified feelings are still there. We may never know the cause of all of our magnified feelings, and that's okay. We will also never know all the causes of magnified feelings of others. So when we're talking to youth about magnified feelings, about where these strong reactions are coming from, it's going to be really common and normal for them not to be able to identify why I'm feeling this way. So to leave space for that. We are going to focus on recognition. Once we recognize this may be happening in ourselves, we regain control, even if we don't fully understand why it is happening. And once we recognize it may be happening in our youth, we can adjust our approach and work towards more successful communication. So let's go back to Amy and her story a little bit deeper. So next slide, please. Amy was assaulted at a party at age 16. Her son asked to go to a party. Amy becomes very angry and snaps at her son. Her son is upset and wants to know why he can't go. Amy yells, "Because I said so." Her son storms off, slamming the door. So Amy had an experience in her life that changed her worldview of safety within the world. Amy might now be very sensitive to the party atmosphere. Maybe Amy doesn't connect the past with the uncomfortable feelings now. Sometimes we don't know we have magnified feelings, and try as we might, we can't figure out why we respond the way that we do. We know the higher that we are in our steps, the harder it is to match our intent to our tendency. Equally troublesome, the stronger our magnified feelings are, the harder to match our intent to our tendency. So thinking about the stress stairway again, and to visualize that and to emphasize that the good news about everyday stressors is that we have a reset button. Typically with a good night's sleep and access to what calms us, we wake up and get to start again. Magnified feelings though are with us somewhere deep inside, and when we wake up and start our day, we can have significant impact on our tolerance for stressors throughout the day. Magnified feelings creep back unexpectedly. They are always there, but just below the surface. Magnified feelings can cause us to start our day already halfway up the steps. Our magnified feelings are tricky. They make us think, they help us see a situation more clearly so that we can protect ourselves. But in reality, they take control and remind us of danger, persuading us to take an alternative approach to avoid danger, discomfort, and anxiety. And until we are aware they exist, we are not able to fully control or anticipate them. So we feel somewhat out of control and somewhat surprised when they do appear. Sometimes our magnified feelings come from previous situations with the same individual, and sometimes they come from unrelated past situations. Sometimes we can see where they come from, and sometimes we have to work at figuring out why we respond the way we do. Magnified feelings can appear out of nowhere. You can be having a perfectly good day, no issues at all. Maybe you're taking really good care of yourself and you're noticing you've been lower on your steps all day. But as you get ready to go out, you find yourself climbing your steps and you can't figure out why. Magnified feelings can cause a quick climb, a jump from a lower step to the top without understanding how that happened. And this can happen for our youth as well. Can you think of a situation where your youth appeared perfectly fine 1 minute and then totally angry and upset without what would seem to be a justifiable cause? Think of magnified feelings as a fire brewing inside your stairway. When your magnified feelings are ignited, the fire causes us to run straight up the steps. I know I certainly have been with my youth where things were going well, joking around, laughing, having fun, and then all of a sudden feelings changed because of a phone call, right? Or in the case of my sister, after she talks to my mom, there are some magnified feelings there, right? So I think identifying that within ourselves and within our youth, and maybe starting the conversation with our youth. Again, this whole program is really about emotional intelligence, which is incredibly important. Magnified feelings affect behavior because magnified feelings change our view of safety and comfort within the world. Maybe two people had the same experience, but it never was really exactly the same. How it changed your perception, your feeling of security, your confidence will be different than how another is affected. And the biggest barrier to controlling our magnified feeling is that we often do not know where they come from. However, our body remembers and our body wants to protect us and respond accordingly. And just like us, our youth may have magnified feelings they have experienced that have an increase in stress when reminded. And sometimes when we witness their response, we are confused where this response came from. You may find yourself saying, "You're acting ridiculous. I don't know what the big deal is. He just blew up out of nowhere. I don't know what his problem is. Grow up." So, these can be our responses. And I think to keep in mind, our youth are going to have a lot of stressors that we don't know about. Especially, I think our youth are at home a lot more with schools closing down and a global pandemic. But that might be a magnified feeling and its stressor in and of itself. But when kids are going back to school, in the before times, they spent so much time not with us that they could have a lot of experiences and its stressors that we weren't aware of. Okay, Christy, I am going to end here in case there are any questions, and you can just go to the last slide, which kind of has contact information. So you're going to see a preview of, I thought I'd have time to get into this, but we won't. So here are any questions that folks really want to put into the chat box. So again, this is just a preview of the full 6-hour session in which there would be way more interaction, conversation. It wouldn't be presentation mode like this. We'd actually be able to converse with each other and kind of unpack some of these terms and terminologies and really language of how to broach having these conversations with the youth that we're having. And I know I keep harping on emotional intelligence, but that's really what this program is talking about, is how can I recognize how I'm feeling, where that's coming from, having that conversation with myself, and how will that impact the way I'm communicating with everybody else and my youth in the world. And I think actually the skills we learn here, so this is really focusing on kind of that risk reduction for youth for commercial sex trafficking. But really this can be applied in many different aspects of our life. And I think it is just working that muscle, really forcing us to work that muscle and to practice having challenging conversations and identifying where I'm at, where my youth's at, how that could possibly interact these hard conversations that we're having. And maybe can I have it at a different time when I'm lower on the staircase?
Great, Naomi, I just put in, and I really encourage anybody who's here, if there's pieces where you're like, oh, I wish you could talk a little bit more about that, Naomi, or tell me more about the program. So please put those in the chat if you have those. Naomi, one of the things that I wonder if you could talk about is we do have the 6-hour program scheduled. Can you talk a little bit about the details of what that is? And since I'm sharing the screen, I can't access the link to the interest form for people to sign up. If you could dig that up and maybe drop it in the chat. But just talking about what the 6-hour program is that you're going to be offering.
Sure. So towards the end of November, and I think the first week of December, I'm going to be offering this program in 3 parts, so 3 2-hour sessions, because I really don't think anybody wants to, nor is it healthy to sit in front of a computer for 6 hours. So it's going to be weekly, I think Tuesdays. Sorry, I'm trying to Control V. Here is the form, the sign up form. I think it's the last 2 Tuesdays in November and then the first day of December. So it's going to be Tuesdays 4 to 6. I just put the form in the chat if you want to look at that and sign up. And yeah, we're going to be talking about going down that staircase, not the stress staircase, but sorry, I'm trying to look. Sorry. Where is it?
Naomi, I can go back to the beginning.
So that's fine. So the stress identification, that translating behavior, right? So, so go-to behaviors, what I'm feeling versus what I'm expressing, enhancing communication, so healthy communication skills, and also recognizing the constant messaging that youth is getting about that puts value on themselves and their self-worth, that they're constantly getting from social media and society. Prioritizing needs, so it's identifying needs. So if there's a lot of stressors here, what can I prioritize? And then it's discussing kind of control and blame, right? When I'm feeling out of control, my go-to tendency is to place judgment and blame. And how can I keep myself from doing that while still holding my youth accountable and having boundaries and being a parent, but not to go to possible victim blaming. And then this really important piece and tool about safety planning is how we end, which I love. It's what we do here a lot at the Advocacy Center. So can I create a plan with my youth? Because I'm recognizing that I'm not going to be with them all the time, no matter how much I wish I can turn myself into a little person and put myself on their shoulder and help them get out of stressful situations. I can't do that. So can we talk about what can make you feel safer? And can we identify things that are going to not be safe, scenarios that are not safe? And when you're feeling not safe, who can you call? Who can you reach out to? What can you do? What are some skills that you have? How can you make yourself a little bit safer there? Which I love. And then again, identifying some reinforcements for that youth. I think it's a really great 6-hour conversation. We rolled this out to our staff and there was a lot of engagement there. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping to see all of you there, but also recognize that if you are a parent, it might be hard to attend every week, but I hope to see you there. And I hope that kind of explains what we're talking about.
Great. Thank you so much, Naomi. Yeah, I think for folks to know, this won't be the only time that we offer it, but it is great if you can kind of jump in there. And like Naomi said, we will set it up. It will be online because everything is right now. And it'll be broken up, but we will have the opportunity to set it up as more of a Zoom meeting. So you'll have space to really dig in and reflect for yourself and talk with others. And it will be a smaller group format. So maybe a maximum of about 15 people. And that way you'll really get to kind of build that community. And I think one of the reasons that I really like this program is it ties so well into some of the things that we talked about yesterday when we talked about role modeling boundaries and the roles that adults can do and those gaps that the more we can fill, the less opportunities for exploitive people to take up that space. And so this is really that kind of practical, how do I do it? And how do I think about myself and my role? And on the interest form, you'll see the opportunity to note whether you'd be taking it, thinking about yourself as a parent or a caregiver, or in kind of more personal roles with youth in your life, or your professional work. And I think also both. So really thinking about this is open to folks, no matter which capacity they are working with youth. Mm-hmm. Naomi, one of the questions that went in, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, one of the questions that came into the chat is, are you able to talk a little bit more about the Above the Path program that this was adapted from, or how familiar you are with that?
Yeah, so I know they're a program that's been around for 20 years, and I know they do a lot of consultations and training development and conferences in supporting organizations. That's pretty much what I can say about them, because I don't know if you know more, but I know they do a lot of that supportive stuff with organizations in consultations, looking to enhance trauma-informed practices and developing trainings based on your community. And they also do show up at conferences. And yeah, I can't say too much more. And then they focus around sex trafficking and CSEC.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in right now. Please, if you are interested, fill out that interest form, and Naomi will be sending you some more details about the full 6-hour program. It does have the dates on there. But it is a really excellent, I really appreciate seeing kind of how this all flows together another way of prevention. So thank you so much, Naomi, for giving us that little teaser. And I'm thinking an awful lot about my stress staircase. So.
Oh, my stress staircase is at like pretty high at the beginning of
Yes.
it because of the technical difficulties.
Yes. Great. So we will wrap up the session early. I know it's always awful to have meetings end early. What I will just plug and appreciate is you will get an evaluation that pops up. Please fill that out if you can. Also, we have our last session of our 2 days that is taking place at 1:30 today. And that'll really be the opportunity to hear from just a few of the youth programs that are working in Tompkins County to really help fill those gaps. What are the great work that's happening, and hear a little bit more about them and how they're supporting youth and youth development. And whether you're in Tompkins County or not, it could be interesting to hear about the really good work that's happening. So thank you all, and we will see you again, hopefully at 1:30. All right. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Nice hearing from a few friendly faces.